The sky was a bruised canvas of black and gray, streaked with sudden white flashes of lightning. Flight 487 trembled as it cut through the storm, a massive metal bird at the mercy of nature's fury. Inside the cabin, passengers clutched armrests, knuckles white, eyes wide with disbelief. Screams and whispered prayers collided with the groaning of the fuselage. Oxygen masks dangled uselessly above panicked heads, swaying like pendulums in time with the plane's erratic dance. Every shift of the aircraft made the lights flicker, illuminating terror-stricken faces in brief, harsh snapshots. In seat 11F, a young woman sat upright, unshaken. Her dark eyes, intense and calculating, scanned the cockpit's red and amber warning lights that blinked relentlessly through the storm-tossed haze. While chaos ruled the cabin, she remained an island of composure, her fingers brushing over the edge of a laptop bag at her side. The world around her might have been collapsing, but her mind moved faster than anyone could perceive. A mother, too, rose ahead, sobbed as she tried to soothe a screaming toddler, her own tears streaking across a pale face. Across the aisle, an elderly man whispered prayers, clutching a worn leather Bible as if it could anchor the plane itself. The overhead bins rattled with the force of turbulence, spilling magazines and water bottles into the aisle. Flight attendants shouted instructions that were swallowed by the roar of wind and rain, their eyes wide as panic spread like wildfire. The captain's voice cut through the chaos, wavering with the strain of both authority and fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, both engines have failed. Brace for impact." The words hung in the cabin, heavy and horrifying. Passengers shrieked, some screaming for loved ones, some muttering incomprehensible curses. The plane shuddered violently, throwing some passengers into the ceiling momentarily before seatbelts yanked them back down. Yet in 11F, the young woman's face remained calm, her jaw set, her breathing measured. She pulled a small, concealed radio from her bag and keyed it with precision. The device crackled to life, static cutting into the storm's symphony. She whispered a sequence of numbers and letters, an encrypted signal only a select few could understand. Somewhere high above, a faint reply whispered back through the static. It wasn't air traffic control. It wasn't a commercial airline frequency. It was something else, something trained, precise, dangerous. The turbulence intensified, the cabin lurching as though the storm itself was intent on tearing the plane apart. Windows rattled, and a sudden blast of wind forced a sheet of rain sideways, painting the interior in streaks of water and shadow. A man near the emergency exit froze, hand on the door, wide-eyed, as if contemplating whether to open it in a mad, hopeless bid for survival. Flight attendants grabbed him, pulling him back into his seat. Panic was a living thing, gnawing at every heart, but she didn't flinch. She typed a series of commands into a hidden terminal within her laptop. Green lights flickered across the keyboard, indicators of systems she had no right to access on a commercial flight. The plane pitched violently again, and a young boy screamed, slamming his forehead against the back of the seat in front of him. She reached out and squeezed his shoulder, not in fear but reassurance. "Hold on," she murmured, voice calm, almost hypnotic, though no one but the child could hear her over the cacophony. The plane's warning alarms shrieked, red lights flashing in every corner of the cockpit visible from her angle. She adjusted her seat slightly, then accessed an emergency override panel she had memorized from countless simulations. Fingers flying, she manipulated dials and switches with a precision born of rigorous training. Outside, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating her face in a stark, fleeting glow. Determination carved every feature. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for control. From somewhere above the storm, the faint hum of jets cut through the chaos. It was almost imperceptible at first, drowned by the howling wind and screaming passengers. But as she keyed another signal, the sound became clearer, sharper, the unmistakable roar of twin-engine fighters cutting through turbulence. A mechanical voice, calm and clipped, responded on the encrypted channel. She leaned closer, mouth near the tiny microphone of her radio. "It's them," she whispered to herself. Her pulse quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. "They're listening." The storm battered the fuselage again, forcing the plane into a sickening downward arc. Glass cracked slightly along a window seam, sending tiny shards rattling into the cabin. The mother a few rows ahead screamed, pulling her child close. Flight attendants braced themselves, faces pale, eyes darting to the cockpit, then back to passengers. But the young woman in 11F remained focused, her mind already calculating wind speed, angle of descent, and the hidden trajectory she could command to keep the plane stable. She keyed another sequence into the radio. "Do you read?" she asked quietly, her voice firm despite the chaos. Static filled the cabin like white noise, but then, unmistakably, a voice answered. "Reading you. Confirm identity." She froze for a moment, her hand hovering over the keyboard. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with the awareness that what she was about to reveal, her call sign, would change everything. The roar of the storm outside was nothing compared to the roar inside her mind. She glanced at the passengers, their terrified faces framed by flickering lights, and realized the weight of her next words. Before she could respond, the plane shuddered violently, pitching downward with a sickening lurch that sent a tray of drinks flying into the aisle. The elderly man slammed his fist against the armrest, muttering prayers, while a young woman screamed at her friend to hold her hand. The cabin was a storm within a storm, chaos multiplied by fear. And yet, she remained unflinching. She pressed the radio mic closer to her lips. The storm outside raged, the plane groaned, passengers braced for death, but she whispered her call sign, a string of letters and numbers that had been whispered in top-secret military circles for years. Ghost Raven 11F. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, far above, a sharp crackle of static and engines responding pierced the storm. The radio was silent, but the response was elsewhere, the shadow of jets maneuvering above unseen, yet perfectly synchronized with her commands. Passengers didn't notice the subtle stabilization of the plane at first, only that the violent shaking was lessening ever so slightly. She glanced at her laptop, eyes narrowing as green lights blinked in acknowledgement of the sequence she had triggered. Every calculation, every command, every hidden override she executed was precise, perfect. The plane no longer plummeted uncontrollably. It was dancing with the storm, almost alive under her guidance. But as she exhaled, allowing herself a moment of relief, a creeping awareness gnawed at her. Someone or something above the clouds had heard her call sign. They were not air traffic control. They were not the airline. And now they knew exactly who was on board this doomed plane. The storm roared louder. Lightning illuminated terrified faces in harsh, white flashes, and somewhere, high above, the F-22s broke radio silence. The cabin remained unaware, oblivious to the legend that had just revealed herself in their midst. But the sky knew, the storm knew, and the pilots above, trained, disciplined, dangerous, knew too. And in that realization, a single, terrifying question hung over the passengers. Who exactly was flying with them? And what would happen next? The plane groaned under the storm's fury, each bolt of lightning illuminating panicked faces for a fraction of a second. Outside, the clouds churned like a living beast, lightning clawing through the darkness, thunder rattling the fuselage as if the sky itself were trying to tear the aircraft apart. Inside, Flight 487's passengers were barely aware of the young woman in 11F, whose calm determination stood in stark contrast to the chaos surrounding her. Her hands flew over the laptop keyboard, fingers a blur of motion. Lines of code scrolled faster than anyone could follow, a digital choreography that no ordinary passenger could understand. Hidden controls, encrypted override protocols, and emergency flight systems responded to her commands like instruments in the hands of a master. Each keystroke was deliberate, every calculation precise. She wasn't just reacting. She was orchestrating survival against impossible odds. The faint hum above the storm grew louder, a mechanical roar that cut through the chaos in the cabin. Jets, fighter jets slicing through the black clouds with surgical precision. The young woman's heart didn't race in fear, it raced in anticipation. She keyed another sequence into her hidden radio, her voice a whisper over the static. Confirm position. Immediate support required. For a moment there was only static. Then the calm, clipped voice returned, unmistakably military. Reading you. Identification required. She froze, a shiver running down her spine. This was the moment she had dreaded and anticipated for years. One wrong word could turn allies into enemies, turning salvation into catastrophe. She glanced at the passengers, oblivious to the fate that hung over them, clinging to hope that had no right to exist. The mother, too, rose ahead, whispered, "Please, God," and the young woman's jaw tightened. There was no God in this cockpit, only skill, strategy, and nerve. Her fingers hovered over the mic, then pressed it. The call sign she uttered was almost a prayer in itself. Ghost Raven 11F. Silence followed. The plane pitched violently again, throwing some passengers into their seats with brutal force. A scream cut through the cabin, mingling with the roar of the engines and thunder. Yet above the chaos, through the static of her radio, a sound answered back, a sound she had trained for but never truly hoped to hear again. Confirm visual. Engage protocols if necessary, the voice ordered, calm and authoritative, but threaded with unmistakable urgency. Her pulse quickened. She knew what this meant. The pilots above were no longer mere observers. They were operatives, trained for combat, responding to a single signal that she had just broadcast into the unknown. Somewhere high above, two F-22s banked sharply, cutting through the storm with deadly precision, engines screaming as if challenging the clouds themselves. Passengers screamed again as turbulence struck the plane like a fist. Tray tables flew, water spilled, and a man near the rear yelled incoherently, clutching the armrests as if they could anchor him to reality. She ignored all of it. Her eyes were fixed on the laptop, on the small screens showing the live readouts of the engines, flight path, and hidden communications. Every decision she made was a thread in a fragile web of survival, each movement weighted with lives. Then over the static the voice returned, sharper this time. Ghost Raven 11F, you're exceeding commercial flight protocols. Confirm your identity immediately. Her lips pressed together. The call sign was no ordinary handle. It was classified, legendary, and meant for someone who had long since vanished from public records. Anyone hearing it would know exactly who she was, or who she had been trained to be. And these pilots knew. They were military, elite, and deadly. Recognition in this moment could mean salvation or destruction. The plane lurched violently again, banking to the left as though thrown by an unseen hand. A lightning bolt struck the horizon, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers and flight attendants. A young child, no more than 7, pressed against her mother, wide-eyed and trembling. She reached forward instinctively, gripping the child's arm to steady him. Outside, the F-22s responded to her movements. They weren't just tracking the plane. They were shadowing, predicting, calculating her every input, prepared to intervene at the first hint of failure. The young woman's fingers danced over the laptop, sending subtle signals to stabilize the engines and maintain altitude. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the violent shaking of the plane began to diminish. Oxygen masks still swung, lights flickered, and the hum of panic persisted. But the plane's descent became controlled, deliberate, survivable. Somewhere above, one of the F-22 pilots spoke into the secure comms, voice tight with disbelief. She's actually flying the plane, and she's doing it like she owns the skis." The young woman barely acknowledged the words. She didn't need to. Every calculation, every keystroke, every command was a silent message. Stay alive, keep them alive, hold the storm at bay. But recognition came with its own danger. Over the comms, one of the jets transmitted a single word, "Ghost Raven 11F, why are you alive?" The question cut deeper than the storm ever could. She had trained, risked everything, and disappeared into the shadows years ago. The world had presumed her lost, a casualty of a classified operation gone wrong. And yet here she was, guiding a plane full of strangers through a storm that would have destroyed even the most experienced pilots. Now, her cover was blown, her identity revealed to deadly operatives above. Her hands froze for a heartbeat. She had no time to explain, no time for hesitation. Passengers' screams pierced the cabin again, a reminder of why she was still here. She keyed the radio again, voice calm but authoritative. "I'm on board Flight 487. Engines compromised. I have control. Maintain course and assist only if necessary. Lives at stake." "Silence then. Copy. Protocol override confirmed. Do not engage unless you lose control." The words were a lifeline, yet also a warning. They trusted her, but only barely. One misstep, and she would face the combined firepower of two of the most advanced fighter jets in existence. She swallowed, jaw tight, and returned her focus to the plane. Lightning flared, illuminating the storm outside, revealing jagged peaks of cloud that looked like frozen mountains. The plane pitched again, throwing passengers forward. Screams echoed. Flight attendants shouted reassurance that sounded hollow against the chaos. She took a deep breath, recalculated, and adjusted a subtle series of controls. The engines responded almost magically, stabilizing the aircraft just enough to prevent a nosedive. The F-22s above followed her movements, silent sentinels in the storm. Somewhere inside, she felt the weight of their scrutiny, the intensity of recognition from operatives who had trained to eliminate threats, not guide planes through disasters. But she didn't flinch. She had trained for impossible odds, and this moment, though more personal than any mission, was no different. A passenger near the window screamed, pointing at the sky. "What's that? Are those jets?" She glanced at the display monitors. Yes, F-22s, deadly and sleek, cutting through the storm like predators. Their presence confirmed that she wasn't just fighting the storm. She was playing a dangerous game of trust with highly trained killers who had no idea if she was friend or foe. Her lips pressed together. She whispered to herself almost silently, "Keep them alive just one step at a time." The plane's violent descent slowed. The cabin was still chaos, but for the first time, survival felt possible. Outside, the jets maintained their positions, engines roaring, cutting through the darkness with lethal precision. Inside, she tapped into emergency protocols few pilots would ever touch. Slowly, meticulously, she began to regain control over the faltering engines. But even as she worked, she knew, revealing her call sign had consequences. The pilots above recognized her. They were not ordinary operatives. They were elite, trained to hunt ghosts like her. And now, in the middle of a violent storm, guiding a commercial plane full of innocent lives, she had just made herself visible to the most dangerous people in the sky. The storm raged on, and passengers remained oblivious to the deadly chess game unfolding above. Screams, sobs, and the relentless roar of thunder filled the cabin. Yet the young woman in 11F remained calm, calculating, determined. She was not just a passenger anymore. She was the fulcrum of survival, and the moment of revelation was only beginning. The voice of the F-22 pilot crackled again, cutting through static. "Ghost Raven 11F, hold steady. We've got eyes on you. Any sudden move and we take control." Her jaw tightened. She exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing with resolve. The storm wasn't over. The plane wasn't safe. And the pilots above, deadly, elite, unyielding, were waiting. Somewhere in the endless black above the clouds, a new question formed. Would she survive long enough for anyone to know why she was still alive? The plane pitched sharply again. Oxygen masks swung. Passengers screamed. And 11F remained the eye of the storm, calm, calculating, and about to face her greatest test yet. The storm outside had become a living entity, thrashing the plane with relentless fury. Bolts of lightning split the sky, illuminating the jagged clouds like shards of glass, each flash revealing terrified faces, overhead bins swinging wildly, and rain streaking the cabin windows in blinding sheets. Flight 487 pitched violently, sending drinks flying, passengers slamming into armrests, and luggage tumbling into the aisles. The roar of the engines was almost drowned out by screams. Yet, in seat 11F, the young woman's calm persisted, her dark eyes scanning the laptop's flashing lights as if reading the heartbeat of the plane itself. Above the chaos, two F-22 fighter jets tore through the storm with uncanny precision, slicing through the blackened clouds as though gravity and weather were mere suggestions. The pilots inside were elite, trained to react in microseconds, yet their eyes widened in disbelief as they monitored the signals coming from Flight 487. The call sign they had just heard, Ghost Raven 11F, was one they thought was lost to history. The woman behind that call sign had vanished years ago, a ghost in the classified archives, and now she was guiding a commercial plane through a storm that would have destroyed even the most experienced aviators. Confirm visual, one of the pilots whispered into the secure comms, voice tight with tension. Do you copy 11F? The young woman pressed the mic lightly, her voice calm, precise. I have control. Maintain observation, no engagement. Lives at stake. The F-22 pilots exchanged glances, a combination of awe and incredulity flashing across their faces. Recognition was instantaneous. They had trained for scenarios like this, but nothing in their careers had prepared them for a ghost Raven to appear in a commercial cockpit, guiding a plane to survive a storm that would flatten even military-grade aircraft. Inside the cabin, passengers had no idea of the danger lurking above. To them, the turbulence was violent but mundane, a terrifying storm flight. Flight attendants shouted reassurances, though their own voices trembled under the tension. Children clutched parents, strangers hugged strangers, and an elderly man muttered frantic prayers, his knuckles white against the Bible he gripped. All the while, 11F's occupant remained composed, hands dancing across hidden controls with uncanny precision. Her laptop pinged with confirmation of her system overrides, a subtle glow on the screen signaling that the failing engines were stabilizing. Slowly, carefully, she adjusted throttle inputs, shifting power in ways most commercial pilots would never attempt, balancing the plane's descent with a skill that bordered on impossibility. The violent lurches lessened just enough to give passengers a fleeting sense of hope, but only fleeting because the storm still raged with unrelenting force. Outside, the F-22s mirrored her every move, engines screaming as they banked and weaved through clouds and lightning. One pilot murmured almost to himself, she's actually doing it. And she's alive, God help us, she's alive. Recognition came with unspoken tension. Ghost Raven 11F wasn't just a call sign, it was a legend. Classified, untouchable, and thought dead after a catastrophic mission years prior. The pilots knew enough to be terrified. Any misstep could unleash a devastating response from her, the plane, or the storm itself. And yet, she wasn't harming anyone. She was saving lives, controlling a plane far beyond the limits of a commercial flight's engineering. Back inside, passengers clung to life and hope in equal measure. A young boy no older than 7 buried his face into his mother's shoulder, crying silently, unaware that salvation was guiding the plane from 11F. A flight attendant grabbed a spilled tray, sweeping scattered drinks and water bottles aside with shaking hands. The plane's overhead lights flickered violently, shadows leaping across faces. And through it all, 11F remained the center of calm, her hands orchestrating a fragile balance between chaos and control. Then, over the secure comms, one of the fighter pilots spoke again, voice low and clipped. Ghost Raven 11F, you are exceeding every safety protocol known to commercial and military aviation. Explain yourself. Her lips pressed together. The legend of Ghost Raven was known only in top-secret briefings, files locked away in government archives, spoken of in hushed tones. No one outside those circles could comprehend her abilities or her presence here in this doomed commercial flight. She chose her words carefully, her voice steady. Engines compromised, lives at stake, override systems engaged, maintain observation, no interference unless absolute necessity. The pilot hesitated, recognition battling caution. You're Ghost Raven 11F, alive. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, monitoring the plane's systems as they reacted to her adjustments. She didn't answer immediately. Any hesitation could signal weakness. Any misstep could trigger a deadly response. Outside, the storm howled, wind shearing past the fuselage like knives. Lightning struck dangerously close, illuminating terrified faces and the young woman's calm expression in stark contrast. Finally, she whispered into the mic, alive and focused. That is all you need to know right now. Her words sent a ripple of tension through the pilots above. Ghost Raven 11F had been a myth, a figure erased from the public eye after a mission gone catastrophically wrong. To encounter her here, guiding a failing commercial plane through a violent storm, was beyond anything they could have imagined. Every instinct screamed at them to take control, to intervene, to assert authority. But instinct and logic collided, leaving them suspended in awe, uncertainty, and unspoken fear. The plane pitched sharply again, throwing passengers forward as the seatbelts dug into their shoulders. A mother screamed at her child to hold on. The elderly man muttered a prayer under his breath, hands pressed together in desperation. Flight attendants tried to maintain composure, shouting instructions through fear-laden voices. And through it all, the young woman in 11F remained a calm, precise force of nature, orchestrating survival with quiet authority. Outside, one of the F-22 pilots adjusted formation, banks tight, engines roaring in tandem with the young woman's inputs. He whispered, almost to himself, "She's actually doing it. No one should be able to do this. Not a civilian, not anyone." Her laptop beeped again, signaling engine stabilization. The violent shakes subsided enough for a momentary collective breath among the passengers. The plane, against all odds, had begun to stabilize. Yet, even as relief crept into the cabin, an undercurrent of dread lingered. The storm wasn't gone. The pilots above were still watching, and her identity had just been revealed to two of the most dangerous men in the sky. The F-22 pilots broke the tense silence, voice clipped, commanding, "Ghost Raven 11F, we will maintain visual, but any deviation from control and we take over. Understand?" Her jaw tightened, understood. It was not a threat. It was acknowledgement. She had survived the storm this far, controlled failing engines beyond any protocol, and now her legend had awakened the attention of those trained to recognize it instantly. Above the clouds, the fighter jets moved with deadly precision, waiting, watching, ensuring that the chaos below did not become catastrophic. Inside, passengers remained oblivious to the deadly ballet unfolding above. They only felt the storm, the plane's violent shudders, and the faint hope that someone, anyone, was in control. They could not see the precision of her actions, the calculations running through her mind, or the fact that two of the most elite pilots in the country now recognized the young woman as a living legend. The storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the cabin in jagged bursts. The plane pitched, lurching violently again, throwing the elderly man against his seat. A young child cried. A woman screamed. And 11F, the epicenter of calm, adjusted the throttles with the precision of a veteran, guiding the aircraft as if it were an extension of her own body. The voice of one F-22 pilot crackled again over the secure comms, quiet, almost reverent. "Ghost Raven 11F, hold steady. We've got eyes on you. Don't make a mistake." Her lips pressed together, jaw tight. She exhaled slowly. Every action mattered. Every second mattered. Lives hung in the balance. And somewhere above, the elite pilots who had trained to face ghosts were witnessing one walk among the living, commanding the impossible. The storm's roar continued unabated, the plane's violent shudders threatening to undo her efforts. But she was relentless, her focus absolute. And yet, a gnawing realization settled in. Recognition by the F-22 pilots could mean salvation, or it could unleash consequences she hadn't anticipated. The storm was far from over. The pilots above were deadly, observant, and now aware. The plane's engines responded, the violent shakes subsided, and passengers clung to hope they didn't yet understand. But above, high in the clouds, the shadow of recognition hung heavy, and the question loomed over all of them. Now that they knew who she was, what would come next? The storm above and around Flight 487 showed no mercy. Lightning slashed through the blackened sky, illuminating the twisted shapes of clouds like shattered glass, each flash exposing frightened faces in stark white light. The plane shuddered violently, its fuselage groaning under stress. Oxygen masks swung like pendulums and passengers screamed, clinging to one another in desperation. Yet in seat 11F, the young woman sat unmoving, her eyes locked on the laptop screen, calculating angles, throttle adjustments, and the subtle physics of flight in real time. Her calm was unnatural, almost unreal in contrast to the chaos that surrounded her. Above the storm, the two F-22 fighter jets adjusted formation. Pilots had trained for every conceivable scenario, but nothing had prepared them for this. A ghost Raven, a legend presumed lost years ago, controlling a commercial plane through a storm that would have torn any other aircraft apart. Recognition sparked something dangerous, awe mixed with fear, admiration shadowed by the instinct to intervene. "Copy visual," one pilot murmured into the secure comms, voice taut. "Ghost Raven 11F, you are alive. Confirm your objective. Are you rogue or rescue?" She pressed the mic lightly, keeping her expression neutral, voice calm. "Rescue. Lives at stake. I have control. Intervention unnecessary unless absolute emergency." The words barely registered in the cockpit of the F-22s. Recognition carried weight. The call sign was no ordinary handle. It belonged to someone who had vanished under classified circumstances, leaving only myths behind. Top-secret briefings had spoken of her in hushed tones. Now, she was alive, in the eye of the storm, orchestrating survival with precision that defied belief. Inside the cabin, passengers were unaware of the deadly recognition above. The plane pitched again, violently, throwing a mother and her child against the seat in front. Flight attendants shouted reassurance, but their voices quavered. Drinks spilled, luggage tumbled, and overhead bins rattled like storm-tossed chests. And yet, 11F remained the epicenter of calm, hands moving with meticulous precision over controls that were never meant for civilian use. She keyed another sequence into her laptop. Green lights blinked in confirmation of subtle adjustments she had made to engine thrust and wing flaps. Slowly, the violent shudders began to ease. Passengers clutched their seats, noticing only that the plane's descent had stabilized slightly. Hope flickered briefly in terrified eyes, but it was fragile, precarious as the storm still raged outside. The F-22s tracked her every input, responding in tandem, engines roaring like predators slicing through clouds. One pilot leaned closer to the comms, voice tight with disbelief. "She's actually flying the plane, and she's alive. We thought she was gone." Recognition, however, came with danger. The pilots had orders to identify, intercept, and neutralize threats. Their instincts screamed that she might be a rogue asset or a risk to national security. Yet every move she made was calculated to preserve lives, not harm. The paradox left them frozen in awe, suspended between their orders and the reality of what they were witnessing. The plane pitched sharply again, sending passengers forward in sudden jolts. A child screamed. A man prayed aloud. Flight attendants struggled to maintain order. And 11F, the calm center of this storm, adjusted the throttles with surgical precision, each movement a defiance of both physics and probability. The voice of one F-22 pilot cut through the static, taut with tension. "Ghost Raven 11F, you are operating well beyond commercial flight safety parameters. Explain yourself." Her jaw tightened. Her legend was not meant to exist in this world of ordinary flight procedures. She pressed the mic lightly. "Engines compromised, lives at stake, override protocols engaged, intervention unnecessary unless extreme emergency. That is all." A pause, then almost whispering, the pilot said, We thought you were dead. How are you alive?" Her fingers never paused, eyes scanning every readout, every gauge, every flashing warning light. She did not answer immediately. The legend of Ghost Raven was not hers to explain. Survival mattered more than history. Lightning illuminated the cabin again, a stark white flash showing fear, terror, and hope etched on every face. The plane pitched violently once more, threatening to throw passengers to the floor. She adjusted the controls with a skill that seemed almost inhuman, steadying the aircraft against the storm's violent whim. Slowly, carefully, she regained partial control. The F-22 pilots above whispered among themselves, disbelief in their voices. She's actually doing it, she's alive, and she's saving them. Recognition now carried weight beyond words. Ghost Raven 11F had been erased from records after a failed mission, classified as lost in the field. Her survival was not supposed to be possible. And yet, here she was, commanding a failing aircraft through a storm that would have crushed even the most experienced military pilots. Inside, passengers were oblivious to the deadly stakes above. They only felt the violent pitch of the plane, the roar of the engines, and a fragile flicker of hope that their lives were not entirely at the mercy of the storm. Flight attendants clutched their arms, bracing for impact, while the young woman in 11F operated with a calm born of years of impossible training. Another sharp lurch. A bolt of lightning struck close enough to shake the fuselage. Passengers screamed again, clutching one another, tears streaking faces. The plane shuddered violently, a metallic groan echoing through the cabin. And still, she remained unflinching, adjusting flaps, throttles, and stabilizers with precise timing, each keystroke and movement a calculated act of survival. The comms crackled again. "Ghost Raven 11F, hold steady. Any sudden deviation and we take over. Understood." Her jaw tightened. "Understood," she replied, voice calm, eyes focused. But recognition, as awe-inspiring as it was, had consequences. The pilots above now understood who she was. Elite, trained, lethal, even her legend carried weight that could either save or destroy. Any mistake, any miscalculation could trigger a deadly response. She was no longer just a pilot saving a plane. She was a legend walking among the living, observed by operatives trained to react without hesitation. The storm raged, relentless. The plane's violent shakes gradually eased, a testament to her skill. Passengers, sensing a small measure of stability, whispered prayers of relief. But the undercurrent of tension persisted. Above the clouds, the elite pilots knew the truth. Ghost Raven 11F was alive, guiding a plane through near-impossible odds. And recognition meant that the next move, hers or theirs, would determine the fate of every soul on board. Lightning flashed again. The young woman adjusted the plane's controls, keeping the descent steady. Green lights confirmed that the engines were responding. She glanced at the terrified faces around her, faces she had sworn to protect. Her own pulse remained steady, though a flicker of unease crossed her mind. Recognition by the F-22s was both reassurance and threat. They could save the flight or endanger it. The F-22 pilot whispered again, almost reverently, "She's a Ghost Raven alive, controlling a commercial plane. This isn't possible." Her eyes narrowed. The storm was far from over. The plane stabilized temporarily, but she knew the turbulence could return without warning. Every second mattered. Every calculation was critical. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. The elite pilots above were not just observing, they were ready to intervene if they perceived the slightest mistake. The cabin shook violently once more. A scream pierced the air. The plane lurched. And in 11F, the young woman adjusted the throttles, fingers dancing over hidden controls, eyes calculating, heart steady. Lives depended on her. Survival demanded it. And recognition, dangerous, off-filled, impossible recognition, loomed above, waiting to strike if she faltered. For a fleeting moment, the storm seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. The plane quivered in the eye of this tempest. And the question, silent but deadly, hung in the air. Now that they knew who she was, would they help or would they strike? The plane shuddered violently as Flight 487 fought the storm, every bolt of lightning cutting across the sky like jagged knives. Inside, passengers clutched one another, their faces pale and drenched with sweat. Flight attendants shouted over the roar, guiding children, assisting the elderly, and struggling to maintain a semblance of calm in a cabin gripped by panic. Amid the chaos, in seat 11F, the young woman remained composed, a pillar of focused determination. Every instinct, every skill she had honed in years of training surged into action. This was not just survival, it was orchestration at the edge of impossibility. Her eyes darted to the laptop screen as the engine readouts flickered, alarms echoing the storm outside. Both engines were compromised, the turbine pressures spiking unpredictably. Any wrong adjustment could send the plane into a catastrophic nosedive. Her hands moved over the hidden override controls, toggling sequences, manipulating the throttles, stabilizing airflow, and recalculating descent in real time. Every second was a tightrope. The lives of 180 people depended entirely on her. Above the storm, the F-22s roared, engines slicing through clouds as though they were made of silk. The pilots recognized the call sign she had revealed, Ghost Raven 11F, and instinct warred with respect. Orders had been clear: intercept, assess, and neutralize threats, but this was no ordinary threat. This was a legend alive and operating far beyond expected limits. One pilot gripped the control stick tighter than ever. She's controlling a commercial flight. Unreal. His partner nodded grimly, voice taut. We maintain formation. No engagement unless she loses control. Inside, 11F's occupant felt the weight of recognition even as the storm battered the fuselage. A mother 2 rows ahead clutched her child, whispering frantic prayers. A young boy cried, wide-eyed, as his father tried to comfort him. She glanced at them, swallowing, and pressed the throttle slightly forward. The engines groaned but responded, shuddering back into stability. Then came the critical decision point. The plane was descending toward a stretch of turbulent air miles below, lightning splitting the sky, winds reaching impossible velocities. Her calculations indicated she had two options: attempt a risky maneuver through a safer corridor that required near-perfect timing and precision, or maintain current altitude and face the storm head-on, risking catastrophic turbulence. The F-22 pilots above were watching, waiting for any misstep that could force them to intervene. Intervention could save lives, but it could also trigger disaster. Her fingers hovered over the controls, heart steady, mind sharp. Lives, numbers, probabilities, all ran through her head like a digital supercomputer. One miscalculation, one wrong tilt, and everyone on board would be thrown into the storm's deadly grip. Sweat streaked her face, her dark hair plastered against her forehead, but her eyes betrayed no hesitation. She whispered under her breath, "I have no choice." Outside, lightning flared, illuminating the wings, the passengers, the quaking cabin, and the endless dark clouds beyond. The plane pitched sharply, throwing an elderly man forward in his seat. He gripped the armrest, muttering frantic prayers, while the young woman in 11F made the decision that could either save them all or destroy everything. She adjusted the throttles, banking the plane carefully into the corridor she had calculated. The fuselage groaned, responding as if resisting her command. The F-22 pilots above followed her every movement, engines screaming in synchrony with the plane's precarious adjustments. One whispered over comms, barely audible over the roar, She's actually doing it. This isn't possible. She can't survive this." Yet she did. Every tilt, every adjustment, every minor calculation brought the plane closer to survival. The storm lashed at them, rain cutting through the fuselage, wind thrashing the wings, lightning striking close enough to send sparks dancing across the cabin windows. The passengers screamed, some gripping their neighbors, others gripping their seats, unaware that each violent shudder was being meticulously countered by the young woman in 11F. And then a new challenge emerged. The plane's navigation system began to flicker, warning lights blinking in warning sequences she had not anticipated. The turbulence had overloaded the electronic sensors. A second decision loomed: trust her instinct and manual override skills, or rely on the failing systems and risk sudden catastrophic failure. She exhaled slowly, jaw tight, and reached for the manual stabilizers, bypassing the sensors entirely. "Focus," she whispered to herself, hands moving in near-perfect synchronization. Her mind calculated wind speeds, engine pressure, flight angle, and lift ratios faster than anyone could follow. The plane responded, almost miraculously, stabilizing as the turbulence continued its relentless assault. The F-22 pilots above whispered to one another, awe-threaded with apprehension. "She's controlling both engines manually. She's guiding a commercial aircraft like it's a fighter jet," one murmured. Recognition carried consequences. Orders from higher command were clear. Any unauthorized action by Ghost Raven 11F could be grounds for immediate intervention, lethal if necessary. But the pilots above realized she was the only one capable of keeping Flight 487 alive. They remained in formation, engines roaring, watching, waiting for the moment to intervene, if it came. Inside, passengers remained unaware of the deadly calculus occurring above. They only felt the violent lurches, the scream of the engines, the tension in the cabin. A flight attendant pressed herself against a bulkhead, eyes wide as the plane pitched violently. A young child screamed for his mother, who clutched him tightly, her own eyes wet with tears. Yet in the eye of this storm, 11F remained the calm center, orchestrating survival with uncanny precision. The critical corridor loomed ahead, narrow, a barely navigable path through the storm. The young woman's pulse remained steady, though the weight of the decision pressed on her mind. Miscalculating the angle, misjudging the wind, any mistake would be fatal. She keyed the throttle forward slightly, banking the wings carefully, and began threading the plane through the corridor. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the plane's wings as it tilted dangerously. Passengers screamed, some crying, others gripping the armrests for dear life. The plane pitched again, but her calculations were perfect, just enough to keep the descent controlled, just enough to prevent disaster. The F-22 pilots above held their breath, watching in awe. She's actually doing it. We can't touch her. She's saving them all," one whispered. Recognition had transformed into reluctant admiration, tempered with fear. But danger was far from over. Another wave of turbulence struck, stronger than before, threatening to push the plane off course. She adjusted the stabilizers, throttles, and rudder simultaneously, orchestrating a ballet of survival that few could even comprehend. The plane responded, quivering but intact. In the cabin, passengers were screaming again, some holding onto strangers for support. A woman sobbed quietly, clutching her child, while a man muttered prayers he had long forgotten. And all the while, 11F's occupant remained the center of calm, every decision weighted with lives and probability, with instinct sharpened into precision by years of impossible training. She exhaled slowly, jaw tight, as the plane emerged from the worst turbulence of the corridor. Engine alarms had subsided slightly, the wings had steadied, and passengers were clinging to hope that life might continue for another few minutes. Above, the F-22s adjusted formation, engines roaring in the storm, continuing to monitor her actions. Recognition had given way to tentative trust, but it could vanish in an instant if she faltered. Then came the next challenge, a section of the storm where wind shear and lightning converged, a gauntlet that few pilots could survive. She glanced at her laptop, eyes narrowing. This was the ultimate test, the critical decision point that would determine the fate of every life aboard. Her hands moved over the controls with a fluid grace, adjusting throttle, stabilizers, and rudder in perfect harmony. She whispered softly to herself, "Just one step at a time, one step at a time." Lightning illuminated the cabin again, the plane pitched violently, and passengers screamed as the aircraft tilted sharply. But she held, weaving the plane through the storm's gauntlet, calculations precise, every movement deliberate, every breath measured. The F-22 pilots above exchanged tense glances. She's threading the eye of the storm. Unreal, impossible, one whispered. And yet she did it. Somehow, impossibly, Flight 487 stabilized, just enough to survive. But as she exhaled, the realization struck her. Recognition had its price. Now the pilots above knew who she was. They were elite, trained to act instantly, and they were watching her every move. One wrong adjustment, one misstep, and the lives she had fought to save could vanish in an instant. The storm still raged. Engines roared. Passengers screamed, oblivious to the high-stakes decisions being made in real time. And in Seat 11F, Ghost Raven 11F prepared for the next challenge, aware that trust, recognition, and skill were all inextricably intertwined, and that survival demanded she succeed flawlessly against impossible odds. Flight 487 groaned like a wounded beast, its fuselage quivering under the relentless assault of the storm. Lightning sliced through the black sky, each flash revealing terrified passengers pressed against seats and one another. Rain pounded the windows, streaking them with sheets of water, while the howling wind twisted the plane's frame, threatening to rip it apart. Inside, the cabin was chaos. Children screamed, adults shouted prayers or cursed the heavens, and flight attendants clutched railings, trying to maintain the illusion of control. Amid this tempest, Seat 11F remained an island of calm, a nucleus of impossible focus. The young woman's hands flew over her laptop and hidden controls, adjusting throttles, flaps, and rudder with a precision that defied comprehension. Both engines had stabilized for the moment, but warning lights still blinked aggressively, signaling stress on the turbines and hydraulics. Any miscalculation could send the plane into a death spiral. Every second was a razor's edge. Every choice could mean life or obliteration. Above the storm, the F-22s mirrored her movements, slicing through clouds with engines screaming like hunting predators. The pilots had recognized the call sign, Ghost Raven 11F, a legend believed dead for years. Their amazement was tinged with fear. Any misstep could require them to intervene, but intervention carried risks. She was proving she could control the plane far beyond anyone's expectations. Maintaining visual, one pilot murmured into the secure comms. Ghost Raven 11F, your maneuvers are precise. Are you stable? Her eyes narrowed as she adjusted a microcontrol on the rudder. Engines stabilized. Temporary safe corridor established. Expect turbulence spike ahead. Prepare observation only, no engagement. Lightning flared, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers. The plane lurched violently, sending a tray of food flying across the cabin, striking a young man in the shoulder. Children screamed. Flight attendants shouted instructions that were swallowed by the roar of the engines and wind. But in 11F, she barely flinched, adjusting the stabilizers with near-perfect timing. Her mind raced, calculating wind velocity, engine output, lift ratios, and potential turbulence pockets simultaneously. The corridor she had threaded through was only temporary. Beyond it lay the heart of the storm, a maelstrom of wind shear, lightning, and unpredictable gusts. She had seconds to prepare the aircraft and passengers for the next onslaught. The F-22 pilots above were tense. Recognition had morphed into reluctant admiration. She's actually doing it, controlling a commercial jet like a fighter, one whispered. Impossible, the other muttered, eyes locked on the plane as it sliced through violent cloud formations. Inside, chaos escalated. The plane lurched violently again, throwing a mother and child against the seat back ahead. Screams echoed, mingling with alarms and the roar of the engines. The young woman in 11F leaned into the laptop, lips pressed together, calculating the trajectory of every micro-movement. Her fingers flew, executing adjustments with the precision of a seasoned pilot in combat, balancing the aircraft against forces that could crush it in seconds. Then came the critical moment. A violent gust struck the plane broadside, forcing it into a near nosedive. Passengers screamed, seatbelts digging into shoulders, arms flailing. The plane shuddered, groaned, and tilted dangerously. One of the F-22 pilots gritted his teeth. "She's about to hit the worst turbulence of her life," he muttered. She reacted instinctively. Throttles forward, rudder slight adjustment, stabilizers engaged. The plane responded, shivering, fighting the wind, barely clinging to a survivable trajectory. The cabin lurched violently, glasses spilling, passengers gripping each other. But she held. Somehow, impossibly, Flight 487 remained airborne. The F-22s moved closer, not to intervene but to monitor. They could see the micro-adjustments, the rapid calculations, the unwavering focus of a pilot who was more than a legend. She was a force of nature. "She's holding it together." "Barely," one whispered, voice tense. But the storm was not done. Another bolt of lightning struck perilously close, sending a jolt through the fuselage. Warning lights flashed violently, alarms shrieking. One engine shuddered, spiking beyond safe thresholds. The plane tilted again, dangerously. Passengers screamed, some clutching armrests, others crying out for loved ones. A mother hugged her child tightly, whispering, "It's going to be okay," though neither believed it. In 11F, Ghost Raven 11F's mind raced. She had seconds to decide. Attempt a maneuver that could stabilize both engines simultaneously or rely on the failing sensors, risking sudden loss of control. She chose instinct over equipment, bypassing the sensors entirely and taking full manual control. Just hold," she muttered under her breath. The plane responded, shuddering violently but obeying her guidance. She adjusted throttle, rudder, and stabilizers in a delicate balance, threading Flight 487 through the storm's worst turbulence. Outside, the F-22s mirrored her every movement, engines roaring in tandem, tracking every tilt, every adjustment. A passenger yelled, "We're going down." "No," she whispered fiercely, pressing her lips together, eyes calculating. "We're not going down, not today." Her body moved with the plane, instinct and training fused into one. Sweat streaked her face, her muscles ached, but her mind remained razor-sharp. The engines groaned under stress but held, slowly responding to her precise inputs. Above, one of the F-22 pilots spoke into the comms, voice taut. "Ghost Raven 11F, your maneuvering is beyond comprehension. We're monitoring, but any deviation, we take control." She didn't answer. She couldn't afford distraction. Every second was a battle, every movement critical. The storm's fury threatened to tear the plane apart. She had already stabilized it once, but now the gauntlet was worse. Wind shear came from every direction, rain tore across the windows, and lightning struck unpredictably. And then a sickening jolt. One engine faltered, warning alarms blaring. The plane lurched violently, cabin lights flickering. Passengers screamed, some thrown from their seats, others gripping tightly. A young boy clutched his mother's arm, eyes wide with terror. She exhaled, jaw tight, and keyed another sequence into her hidden control panel, rerouting power to stabilize both engines. The plane shuddered violently but responded, climbing back into a survivable altitude. The F-22 pilots above exhaled almost collectively. She's alive," one whispered, "and she's controlling it. How?" But recognition came at a cost. Now that they knew she was Ghost Raven 11F, they watched every move, poised to intervene at the slightest error. Every adjustment she made was under scrutiny, every decision a potential trigger for lethal force. Inside, the passengers had no idea that a living legend was guiding their plane through the storm. They only felt the violent shakes, the roar of engines, and the faint sense that survival was possible by some miracle. Lightning flashed again, illuminating terrified faces. The plane pitched sharply, but she maintained control, fingers flying, calculations precise. The engine stabilized just enough to keep the plane from spiraling out of control. Yet deep down, she knew the worst was still ahead. The storm was relentless. The F-22s above were deadly, observing, calculating. And now her identity had been fully revealed. Any misstep, any miscalculation, and the lives she had fought to save could vanish instantly. She pressed her lips together, exhaling slowly. The storm was far from over. Survival required more than skill. It required absolute precision, nerves of steel, and the unthinkable courage to defy impossible odds. The cabin shook again. Screams pierced the air. And in 11F, Ghost Raven 11F prepared for the next challenge, knowing that the brink of disaster had only just begun, and that the pilots above were waiting, watching, and ready to act if she faltered. The question loomed over everyone on board, silent but deadly. Could she keep them alive, or would the storm, the failing engines, and the deadly eyes above finally claim Flight 487? Lightning tore through the black sky like jagged spears, illuminating the quaking fuselage of Flight 487 in sudden, violent bursts. Rain pelted the windows, cascading in sheets that blurred the world outside. Inside, chaos had reached a crescendo. Passengers screamed, some gripping the arms of strangers, others clutching their children so tightly it was as if sheer will could keep them alive. Flight attendants were pressed against the bulkheads, shouting instructions that were mostly lost in the roar of engines and storm. Yet amid the chaos, Seat 11F remained an improbable bastion of calm, a lifeline that no one yet understood. Ghost Raven 11F's hands danced over the hidden controls, throttles, and stabilizers, orchestrating a symphony of survival that no ordinary pilot could even comprehend. The engines, already stressed to their limits, shuddered violently with each gust of wind. Warning lights blinked feverishly, flashing codes she had memorized but never expected to see in a commercial airliner. Every adjustment, every microcorrection was a life-or-death gamble, and she executed them with a calm born of years of impossible training. The F-22s above mirrored her maneuvers, slicing through the storm like predators tracking prey. Their pilots had recognized her, and awe mingled with apprehension. Ghost Raven 11F was not just alive. She was performing feats no one thought possible, keeping a commercial jet airborne against near-impossible odds. One pilot murmured into the secure comms, voice tight with disbelief. "She's controlling both engines manually. This isn't possible. We thought she was gone." Recognition had consequences. The F-22s hovered, engines screaming in unison with the chaos below, waiting for a misstep that might force them to intervene. Intervention could save the flight or destroy it. Every move she made was under surveillance, her identity now a double-edged sword, awe, admiration, and deadly scrutiny all at once. Inside, the passengers were oblivious to the deadly calculus occurring above. They only felt the violent pitches, the screams of children, the roar of the engines, and the thin thread of hope that someone, anyone, was keeping them alive. A young mother clutched her toddler, whispering reassurances she did not believe, while a father muttered prayers under his breath, tears streaking down his face. The storm's fury was unrelenting. A massive gust hit the plane broadside, sending it into a near spin. Seats buckled, oxygen masks swung violently, and screams echoed across the cabin. Ghost Raven 11F's hands moved instinctively over the controls, banking the plane, adjusting thrust, stabilizers, and rudder, threading the aircraft through the turbulence with surgical precision. The plane groaned in protest, metal flexing and wings shaking, but it held. The F-22 pilots above exchanged tense glances. "She's threading the eye of the storm," one whispered, voice tight. "Impossible, she's alive and she's saving them all." Recognition had evolved into reluctant admiration, but it also carried a weight of danger. Any mistake, any deviation, and the pilots could be forced to act, lethal, immediate intervention. And the storm was not done. The young woman in 11F glanced at her laptop, calculating the next sequence. The corridor of relative stability was narrowing. Beyond it lay the storm's heart, where wind shear, Lightning and turbulence converged in a maelstrom of forces that could shred the plane in seconds. She had seconds to prepare for the gauntlet. Passengers screamed again as the plane pitched violently, throwing luggage and tray tables into the aisle. A small child's cry cut through the cacophony. Flight attendants struggled to maintain order, shouting over the storm. But none of it touched her focus. She adjusted throttles, stabilizers, and rudder with near-military precision, guiding the plane into the narrowing corridor. Lightning illuminated the cabin, revealing faces etched with terror, sweat, and hope. Green lights on her laptop signaled that engine power was holding, just barely, but the turbulence was intensifying. The plane shuddered, pitching sharply, and she countered instantly. Every adjustment was calculated, precise, vital. One false move and the plane could tumble out of control. The F-22 pilots hovered in tense formation, engines roaring in unison with the violent storm. Recognition had transformed into awe and trust, but it was fragile. Any sudden move from her could trigger them into action, which might save or destroy the plane. One pilot whispered, voice tense, "She's holding the impossible, but for how long?" Then came the heart of the storm. Wind shear struck from multiple directions simultaneously, ripping at the fuselage. Lightning struck perilously close, sending sparks dancing across the cabin windows. Warning alarms shrieked in unison. The plane pitched violently, throwing passengers against seats and each other. Screams erupted as the aircraft trembled, teetering on the edge of disaster. Ghost Raven 11F exhaled slowly, lips pressed together. She had trained for impossible scenarios, but the heart of a storm like this was a test beyond comprehension. Her hands moved with fluidity and precision, throttles, stabilizers, and rudder responding to microsecond adjustments. The plane quivered under the stress, but she held it together inch by inch, second by second. The F-22 pilots above leaned forward, their faces taut with tension. "She's actually controlling the plane through the storm's heart," one whispered, barely audible. "We can't intervene, not yet." Inside, the passengers were unaware that their lives were balanced on a knife edge of skill, courage, and legend. They only felt the violent lurches, the roar of engines, and the fragile hope that someone, somewhere, was guiding them to survival. Another gust slammed the plane sideways. The fuselage groaned. Warning lights flashed red. The engines shuddered. And yet in Seat 11F, Ghost Raven 11F remained the calm center. Her eyes scanned the laptop, calculating trajectories, wind velocities, engine responses, lift ratios. Her fingers danced over the controls, threading the aircraft with the precision of a master pilot in a war she had long survived in secrecy. The F-22 pilots above exchanged glances, almost reverent. "She's a ghost raven, alive, and she's saving lives," one whispered. Recognition carried awe, yes, but also dread. They knew the power and danger she represented. One wrong move and everyone aboard could be lost. Then came the moment of truth. A massive gust struck the plane, pitching it violently downward. The fuselage shuddered, wings twisting under stress. Warning alarms blared in cacophony. Flight attendants clutched railings, passengers screamed, and the cabin lurched dangerously. Ghost Raven 11F reacted instantly. Throttles forward, rudder adjusted, stabilizers fine-tuned. The plane responded, but only barely. She could feel the limits of the engines, the stress on the airframe, the precarious balance between survival and catastrophe. Every muscle, every calculation, every breath was devoted to keeping the aircraft alive. Lightning flashed, illuminating terrified faces. Green lights blinked on her control panel, signaling temporary stabilization. But she knew it wouldn't last. The storm's fury was relentless. She had survived the worst of the turbulence for now, but the next challenge was imminent, unavoidable. The F-22 pilots hovered above, engines screaming, watching, waiting. Recognition had shifted into tense anticipation. Could she thread the plane through the storm's deadliest section without catastrophic failure? Could she survive the gauntlet that no ordinary pilot could endure? Inside the cabin, passengers whispered prayers, clung to loved ones, or stared into space, unaware that their survival hinged on the young woman in 11F. Her hands moved with near-military precision, her mind calculating impossibilities. And yet, despite her calm, a flicker of concern crossed her eyes. Recognition by the F-22s had saved her from interference, for now. But the storm offered no mercy, and the gauntlet ahead demanded absolute perfection. She exhaled, jaw tight, eyes focused. Flight 487 had survived this far, against impossible odds, but the storm's heart awaited, a crucible that would test her skill, courage, and resolve like never before. And in that moment, one terrifying truth loomed over everyone. Survival was possible, but only if she could thread the impossible needle through the storm's heart, without faltering, without error, and without the deadly eyes above turning from watchers into executioners. The storm raged around Flight 487 like a living beast, its blackened clouds torn by jagged lightning. Rain lashed the fuselage, wind threatened to rip the wings from the airframe, and the plane quaked violently with each gust. Inside, the passengers were terror-stricken. Screams, whispered prayers, and clinging hands filled the cabin. The flight attendants fought to maintain composure, bracing against sudden lurches and shouting instructions that the chaos made nearly impossible to hear. Yet at the center of it all, Seat 11F remained a calm eye within the storm, a command post of survival. Ghost Raven 11F's fingers danced across hidden controls, throttles, stabilizers, and rudders. She had fought through turbulence that should have shredded the plane, patched failing engines through manual override, and threaded Flight 487 through impossible wind corridors. Her focus was absolute, her mind a calculating supercomputer of aerodynamics, stress physics, and human survival instincts. One wrong move could end all 180 lives in a heartbeat. Above, the two F-22s mirrored her maneuvers, engines screaming in unison, cutting through the storm like twin predators. Recognition had turned into reverent observation. "She's a ghost Raven alive, and she's keeping that plane from going down," one pilot whispered, voice tight. "We can't touch her," the other added, gripping his controls as sweat slicked his palms. Intervention could save lives, but could also trigger catastrophe if she miscalculated even slightly. Lightning struck close enough to make the plane shudder, overhead lights flickering, warning alarms blaring. The fuselage groaned, passengers screamed, and the engines shuddered violently under the storm's fury. But she held. Every micro-adjustment, every keystroke, every tilt of the stabilizers was perfectly timed. Flight 487 responded as if guided by a master hand, a single will threading through chaos. hold steady," she muttered under her breath, jaw tight. Her eyes scanned the laptop, absorbing data faster than anyone could comprehend. Wind speeds, engine output, turbulence vectors, and structural integrity, all in real time. The corridor of relative stability was narrowing, but she had calculated the path. Every second mattered. The passengers, still screaming and bracing for impact, were unaware of the battle of skill occurring in the cockpit. A young mother whispered desperately to her child, "We're going to make it, we're going to make it," though fear etched every line of her face. Others cried quietly, gripping hands or praying aloud, oblivious to the fact that the young woman in 11F was orchestrating survival with near-superhuman precision. Then came the gauntlet, the eye of the storm itself. Wind shear struck from multiple directions, violent gusts twisting the fuselage, lightning striking dangerously close, showering the wings with sparks. Both engines groaned under strain, warning lights flashing red. Flight 487 lurched violently, teetering on the edge of disaster. Screams pierced the cabin once more. Ghost Raven 11F reacted instantly. Throttle forward, rudder adjusted, stabilizers fine-tuned. The plane shuddered violently, but she guided it with precision. Each movement had been calculated to the millisecond. Her heart pounded, muscles burned with tension, but her mind remained razor-sharp. Survival demanded perfection, and she delivered it. The F-22 pilots above exchanged tense, awed glances. "She's threading the impossible," one whispered. "No one should survive this, yet she is controlling everything." Recognition had morphed into reverent admiration. They watched as a living legend transformed chaos into orchestrated survival. Passengers were tossed forward again as the plane pitched, but 11F's occupant maintained control. A young boy cried, buried in his mother's arms. The mother whispered, it's okay, we'll make it." And for the first time, a flicker of hope sparked in the cabin. They didn't know why, only that someone was keeping them alive. Suddenly, the storm began to relent. Gusts lessened, rain eased, and the plane stabilized at a manageable altitude. The fuselage still quaked, and alarms blared faintly, but the worst had passed. Green lights blinked on the laptop, confirming engine stabilization. The passengers, sensing a lull, breathed shaky sighs of relief, clinging to the fragile hope that they had survived the storm. Above, the F-22 pilots relaxed slightly, though their eyes never left the plane. Recognition had turned to awe. "She's not just surviving, she's leading this plane out," one said softly. "She's a ghost raven indeed." But she wasn't done. Even though the storm's fury had eased, Flight 487 was damaged, engines stressed, and the plane was miles from the nearest airport. She calculated her approach carefully, ensuring they would land safely without overtaxing the remaining systems. Every adjustment required careful thought, precision, and nerve. The lives of 180 people, now aware only of the terror behind them, depended entirely on her next moves. The plane descended steadily, engines whining but stable, wings cutting through thin clouds now illuminated by fading flashes of lightning. Passengers clutched seatbelts, whispered prayers, and held onto each other. They were alive, but the tension in the cabin remained, a tenuous thread, easily broken if the next moment went wrong. As Flight 487 approached the airport, Ghost Raven 11F made the final adjustments. Throttles aligned, stabilizers tuned, and rudder precise. The landing corridor was narrow, visibility still limited, but she had calculated every inch of it. The plane's descent was flawless, each moment executed with the precision of someone who had survived more than just storms, someone who had survived war, missions, and the impossible. The runway lights came into view and passengers gasped collectively, relief mixed with disbelief. The plane was descending safely, wings level, engines holding. A stewardess whispered, "We're going to make it, we're really going to make it." Finally, the tires touched the tarmac with a controlled thud. Brakes engaged, engines groaned as they slowed. The fuselage shuddered, but Flight 487 rolled steadily down the runway. Passengers clapped and sobbed, hugs exchanged, tears flowing freely. They had survived a storm that should have destroyed them. As the plane came to a stop, a hush fell over the cabin. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, calming passengers, checking for injuries. People stared at one another, half in disbelief, half in awe of the miracle they had just survived. And in seat 11F, the young woman exhaled, her face pale but composed, eyes scanning the cabin once more. The F-22s hovered above, engines easing to idle, formation relaxing. Recognition had transformed into respect. Ghost Raven 11F had not only survived, she had saved lives in a scenario no one should have survived. One pilot whispered over comms, voice full of awe, "She's a legend, alive, and she saved them all." At that moment, the world outside and inside Flight 487 seemed to pause. The storm had passed, but the story would live forever. Recognition had been dangerous, threatening intervention at any misstep, but it had also highlighted the impossible skill and courage of the woman in 11F. Passengers began to deplane, clutching loved ones, staggering but alive. Some whispered prayers of thanks, others hugged flight attendants or strangers. The news crews and first responders would later describe it as miraculous. But they had no idea of the real story. The young woman in 11F, a living legend, whose call sign had made the F-22s break radio silence, whose skill had guided Flight 487 through the deadliest storm in decades, and whose calm, precise courage had saved 180 lives. She stepped off the plane last, unnoticed by most, her figure small against the backdrop of flashing lights, emergency vehicles, and storm-tossed tarmac. Her eyes scanned the crowd briefly, observing gratitude, awe, and disbelief. Recognition, after all, had its consequences, but she had survived. She had saved them all. The F-22 pilots hovered in the distance, engines silent now, watching as she walked into the night. Their admiration was palpable, their disbelief deep. The legend of Ghost Raven 11F had not only survived, it had triumphed. And though the world might never fully understand the courage and skill behind that calm figure in 11F, the lives she saved, the terror she overcame, and the storm she conquered would forever carry her mark. And somewhere in the dark sky above, lightning cracked one final time, as if in silent salute to the pilot who had defied death, danger, and the impossible, and emerged victorious.